We're live, fantastic. Hello everyone, greetings from Geneva, greetings from the World Trade Organization, and welcome to the final panel of the day we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the WTO. My name is Bernie Kuyten, and I'm a member of the WTO Secretariat, and I'll be moderating the panel this afternoon. You may wonder why I'm smiling, but I have the ability to watch the panel members coming in right before, and they seem to have a very animated discussion amongst themselves. Maybe they don't need me as moderator, but anyway. So far today, we've had governments talking about 2.5 decades of multilateral trading rules employing in their country, and we had a very interesting discussion. The WTO, although it's still being a young adult, had its setbacks, it has its successes, and it had drama included there. And right now, as you all know very well, the world is experiencing turbulence as never before. The WTO wants to play a role there and wants to help get to a calmer airspace. But for that, it needs to be equipped in order to do so. As General Counsel Chair David Walker said this morning, we need to be fit for purpose. And we certainly can't do this alone. Today's stakeholder panel will no doubt have ideas on what can be done or what should be done. And quite a panel it is. We are fortunate to have top-level people that have witnessed the birth of this organization, saw its accomplishments, saw its shortcomings, as well as its effect on society. And in order of virtual appearance today, we will start off with Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization, followed by Céline Chavria, Executive Director of the Institute of European Environmental Policy. Apologies. Then we'll have Joshua Bolton, President and CEO of the US Business Roundtable, to be followed by Sumaya Keynes, Trade and Globalization Editor of The Economist. Then Martin Chungong, Secretary General of the Interparliamentary Union, will speak. And last but not least, Frank Heemskerk, Secretary General of the European Roundtable for Industry, will take the floor. Now, some of you may wonder why Bugolo Kinuendo from Botswana is no longer part of the list I just mentioned or just named. She unfortunately had to cancel her participation last minute, but she will be surely missed. Now, the panel will be organized as follows. After the introductory remarks, the panel members will have the chance to debate and question each other. And then the last half hour will be dedicated to you, to the audience, the viewers of this panel. And in order to make sure that I say this correctly, I'm going to read out my notes here very carefully. You can submit questions for the panelists via social media or our dedicated Slido page. And if everything works as planned, instructions how to use Slido are now on the screen to be seen, or under the webcast player window. You simply need to enter Slido into your browser and use the event code AskWTO@25. And on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Just send your question using the hashtag AskWTO@25. I cannot guarantee that everybody will get a response, but we'll do the best we can to get as many in as possible. When you put your question, please indicate who you want to answer. Now, without further ado, let me invite our first speaker. I'm going to ask all of you to be concise and speak no longer than 5 minutes to leave us as much time as possible for discussion. Mr. Ryder, Guy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bernie. Very nice to see you again, and greetings to everybody participating in this conversation. Well, I've been asked to say what the WTO at 25 looks like to the International Labour Organization. And of course, as a 100-year-old organization, the WTO seems to us at 25 years old to be a high-achieving young relative, a slightly too distant relative, still inhabiting, by the way, the family home, which is the original building of the ILO, but at a point, like many young adults, as you've described them, Bernie, at a point of reflection, where they've got to think about, in the light of all the achievements to date, where the organization is going next. Now, despite the distance, which in some ways characterizes the relationship between the ILO and the WTO, it's no exaggeration to say that the WTO has fundamentally influenced the work and the institutional life of the ILO over the last 2 decades and more. Why? Firstly, because obviously the WTO has been highly instrumental in powering the growth and the dynamism of a global economy, and this has provided the enabling conditions for the ILO to promote the achievement of many of our own goals: provision of decent work opportunities, reduction of poverty, and this is no small achievement. But the WTO has also conditioned in a very important way part of the basic ILO mission, which is ensuring that this economic growth is accompanied by parallel social progress and advancement. And in this regard, the story goes right back to the beginnings of the WTO. I'm a veteran of the Singapore Ministerial Conference, that first conference in 1996, when the fundamentally important, the seminal debate was raging, and I think that's the appropriate verb to use, about the relationship between trade liberalization and labor standards. And I think we all can recall how that ended up with the WTO saying, look, we're in favor of core labor standards, but really the ILO is the place where they need to be set and dealt with. And it is that Singapore dispensation which has characterized our relationship for the years subsequent. But it also set in place a really important and very fruitful dynamic inside our organization, because it was a direct consequence of the WTO Singapore decisions, which led the ILO into a profound debate about the social dimensions of globalization, the adoption of a Declaration on Fundamental Rights at Work in 1998, and a subsequent one in 2008, which successively made the point that the fundamental principles and rights at work enunciated in our declarations should not be used for protectionist purposes, and then by reflex said, violation of those rights is no legitimate source of comparative advantages in trade. So this is an interesting interaction. Now, in the last years, as this dispensation was in place, and it sometimes felt that barricades had been thrown up down the Rue de Lausanne in Geneva to keep our organizations apart, interesting things happened. Whilst you had this self-denying ordinance at operation in WTO on labor and social issues, different things were happening in trade negotiations at other levels. And let me just give you some numbers to illustrate my point. Today, 50% of trade deals negotiated over the last decade contain labor provisions. The figure 10 years before that would have been 20%. 1/3 of regional trade deals negotiated and notified to the WTO contain labor provisions. And let me just say that this is highly suggestive to a young adult considering the next steps in life. It is suggestive in the first instance that it is becoming increasingly difficult for trade agreements to be concluded in abstraction of their social, labor, and environmental consequences. And I think this is something we're all aware of. It's a characteristic of our political circumstances. And if that is suggestive of further action to be taken, I think it suggests as well that it would be a good idea, without reopening the polemics of the past and past dispensations, perhaps to consider how interorganizational relations might be modified in appropriately addressing the issues emerging. And should the WTO incline in that direction, it will find a very willing and interested partner at the ILO. In the Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work that we concluded last June, there is an instruction to the ILO to reinforce its cooperation with other international organizations and to develop, and I quote, institutional arrangements with those organizations to promote international policy coherence. And there is in that instruction a very specific reference to trade policy inter alia. I'll leave it there, Bernie. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Guy. Those are very interesting points. They bring you back to the past because some of these matters have been discussed before, and they will probably come to us again. Before going over to Céline Cherveria, I just got a note telling me that the Slido explanation wasn't very clear. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to repeat what I just said about Slido. My apologies to the panel for that. You could put Slido in your web browser, Slido, and use the event code AskWTO at 25. You can also put questions via social media and use the same hashtag, AskWTO at 25, to make sure that your questions arrive here and actually arrive to this particular person sitting in this chair. I hope it's clear now. So once again, Slido to be put in your browser using the event code AskWTO at 25. My apologies for that. Guy, thank you again. Shavriat, Miss Shavriat, Céline, I know you for a very long time. The floor is yours.
Hi, Bernie, good to see you. Look, I have a dream. Let's imagine that we are at the 50th anniversary of the WTO. That would be 2045, 5 years away from the point in which the world needs to be climate neutral. And my dream would be that we will be able to say that the WTO played a critical role in winning the race that humanity has to get to zero. And right now, what we see is that we have not managed to harness trade, to flatten the curve of GHG emissions. We still have a major proportion, actually a quarter of global GHG emissions that are due to trade. The other thing to say is in the post-recovery, we see a lot of debate on trade, in my view, quite polarized, certainly where I am in Brussels, where you oscillate between people you are speaking with people say deglobalization is the way forward as part of the recovery, and others saying it's even more liberalization. Within that, we miss a debate about what sort of trade we want to recover and to become climate neutral. And I think we have an organization that's had fantastic accomplishments, but it's also at the risk of losing its license to operate. I must say, I was quite amazed when I heard from a well-informed sources that there were still governments making the case that you could not discuss climate change in the Committee on Trade and Environment. I mean, let's be serious here. We cannot continue to have a major international organization working under premises that are simply ignoring science. So what are key areas for action? The WTO needs to help the world not bounce back, but bounce forward. That means our common goal must be to aim for sustainable well-being for all. How can we live, housing, mobility, nutrition? How can we have everyone have access to this, but with a much lower environmental footprint? This means it's really urgent to have a green trade for green recovery initiatives that will help first and foremost developing countries. How can we make sure that sustainable tourism restarts as early as possible? How do we accelerate transfer of green technology to developing countries? But also we need to make the green economy the new normal. How do we make sure that we co-create low carbon circular standards for products so that every product that is traded in the world is sustainable? How do we also ensure that we accelerate the phase out of the brown economy? The WTO is the only place where it can bring an end to environmentally harmful subsidies. And then last but not least, the WTO needs to be a place where we ensure the equitable sharing of benefits, burden, and risks of greening trade. So three immediate actions for me. One, I'm certainly very happy to see that 49 countries agreed on the statement for trade and environmental sustainability. And I really hope that the structured dialogue will bring together all stakeholders and governments to kickstart that discussion of greening trade for green recovery. The second thing, I really hope that the new DG of the WTO will make sustainability his or her signature issue. We need immediate action to get, finally, after so many years, a WTO agreement on fish subsidy reform. I think with those three actions, the WTO can really get on board this race to zero. Because if not you, then who will do it? And if not now, then when? The clock is ticking and the time is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celine, and thank you for dreaming. The WTO at 50 will probably not be with me anymore because I will probably be too old for that unless they change the retirement age in this organization. You put quite some challenges on the table, and I'm sure we're going to hear more. I'm now going to give the floor to Mr. Bolton. Josh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bernie, and thanks to the WTO and the organizers for including me today. 25 years is certainly a milestone to celebrate, and it's an ideal time to reflect on where the WTO should go from here. I spent much of my early career working on trade policy, 35 years ago as a U.S. Senate staffer and 30 years ago as general counsel at the U.S. Trade Representative's office during negotiation of the Uruguay round. From those experiences, I developed great respect for the role that the then GATT and now WTO play in promoting commerce and prosperity around the world. Today, I serve as the head of the Business Roundtable, an organization of 200 CEOs of America's largest corporations who collectively employ nearly 20 million people. As far as I know, none of those CEOs ever worked in trade policy, but all of them understand how important the multilateral trading system has been, not just to global growth, but to the well-being of their own customers, employees, and shareholders. If you had polled Business Roundtable CEOs 25 years ago, I'm confident that the vast majority would have been encouraged by the then evident success of the multilateral trading system in promoting global prosperity, and they would have expressed optimism about the ability of the fledgling WTO to accelerate what was then the inexorable growth of world trade under ever better rules. 15 years ago, the optimism would probably have remained widespread. Today, not so much. Today, American business leaders are deeply concerned about the many fissures and persistent disarray in the world trading system. They continue to support the WTO, but due to lack of progress over the past decade, they have not seen it sustain its central role today, and they question its role in the future. Why is that? The WTO has not completed a comprehensive negotiation since its creation, or has it adopted new rules for the 21st century that are most important to business today? The world economy has changed a lot over the past 25 years, and the WTO has failed to evolve with it. This is especially true of the challenges posed by the emergence of China as a dominant player in world trade. 3 months ago, the current U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, published an important op-ed that detailed his prescription for fixing the WTO. Several of the elements that he mentioned would find broad support in the U.S. business community and in the U.S. Congress. A recommitment to MFN principles, renegotiation of market access commitments to reflect the size of today's economies, stronger disciplines on state subsidies and state capitalism, limitation of special and differential treatment to the truly least developed countries, and fifth, a faster dispute settlement system that sticks to enforcing agreed upon rules. The lack of progress on the multilateral front over the past decade has been exacerbated by Ambassador Lighthizer's Trump administration's embrace of tariffs and confrontation. Business leaders, the ones in my group, the Business Roundtable, have strongly disagreed with the Trump administration's rejection of multilateralism in favor of unilateralism. Business leaders have opposed its misguided invocation of national security to restrict legitimate trade with friends and allies. And most in my organization are now hopeful that a Biden administration will re-engage multilateral institutions and work to lead an overhaul of the WTO. But, and this is a big but, many of the problems in the world trading system and at the WTO diagnosed by the Trump administration are real. They will not simply disappear with the advent of a more congenial administration. Only a bold and comprehensive reform agenda can restore the central role of the WTO and prevent its downward spiral into irrelevance. To those of us who believe in the multilateral system and the WTO, we must come together to prove it can meet the challenges of today and of the future. If we disagree with what has been happening in trade over the past several years, we must demonstrate that the WTO can evolve and deliver. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Josh. It's an interesting historical perspective to the situation we're in right now, and again, an additional challenge to the list that is simply growing. I'm now going to ask Ms. Gaines, Soumeya, to take the floor and give her perspective on what this organization has been doing or should be doing, or both. Soumeya, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I thought I would, in preparation for this panel, look back, and I have here, The Economist has past issues in a big book. So I thought I would look back to the April 9th, 1994 edition to see what my employer said. I had nothing to do with this. I was, in primary school at the time, but I thought I would share some snippets. So a bit I kind of landed on was, and I'm going to state now, I'm not sure how well some of this is aged, but here we go. So essentially, The Economist is outlining the justification. Here's why the WTO is here, and it says, governments cannot be trusted with trade policy. If, as trade policy activists implicitly assume, governments were competent and dedicated to the public good, there would be less to worry about. Some other stuff. The institutions that liberal democracies use to rule themselves are needed precisely because governments in the real world are often incompetent and always subject to demands from narrow, organized interests. Now, I'm sure if one read that statement out at a WTO ministerial, one would not make many friends. I'm not sure that's quite how governments see themselves. I'm sure every government sees themselves as very competent. But I suppose at the root of that there might be a problem, right? So it's a problem if governments perceive the WTO to be this external institution that's constraining their actions, right? The system is supposed to be self-reinforcing. Each member is supposed to think that it gets more out of the system than it puts in. The moment it becomes primarily an institution to tie one's hands, then in a way that one doesn't actually want, then that's a problem. And it also is a problem if smaller, poorer members think that the institution is simply a forum for big and powerful members to just inform them of what's in their own best interests. Over time, that it doesn't lead to a healthy institution. So I worry essentially that over time problems have emerged in the way that members are thinking about the WTO, the way that members are engaging with it, and that's a problem because there are, as my other distinguished panelists have said, many extremely important problems to be solved. We have fisheries subsidies negotiations. We have climate change, massive problem, requires huge amounts of collaboration and communication. We have the challenges of the digital economy. We have the fact that we've just had a pandemic. We're in a pandemic, and there are huge challenges associated with the subsidies that governments are handing out, and potential for spillovers there. So essentially, given all those challenges, I think it's important. I think the other thing to say is that I think the Trump administration has been essentially a distraction. I think the world was given this character who they could criticize and say, oh, look at the tweets, look at the obsession with bilateral trade deficits. And that sometimes sucked the energy out of the real discussions we needed to be having about the genuine problems within the World Trade Organization. I was pretty stunned that it took Robert Lighthizer until year 4 of his administration to outline the problems, and I'm sure we can have a discussion about which of his solutions are realistic. But I hope that going forward, now that a Trump administration looks to be ending, now is an opportunity for all members to stand back and say, okay, well, what do we get from this institution, and therefore what should we put in? What responsibility do we have to engage with these issues now that we're no longer bemoaning the lack of American leadership? And I will end there.
Thank you, Sumaya. You can leave it to a good journalist to start asking critical and sharp questions, certainly from the economists. Now, I mean, your opening line, governments cannot be trusted, they are incompetent. That's definitely something that you hear a lot. And that morphs nicely into our next speaker, Mr. Chungu Martin. I'm going to ask you to take the floor and give us your perspective from a parliamentary point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benny. Thank you. And great to see you again. And I welcome this opportunity to partake of the 25th anniversary of the WTO. And coming from an organization that is 131 years old today, I see 25 years as relatively young, but looking at what has been achieved, looking at the international recognition that the World Trade Organization has acquired, I would say that it has come a long way. And rather than bemoaning the difficulties and the crisis it has faced, we should be looking at how we can help strengthen it. And I think that the first thing we have to recognize, and it has been recognized, is that WTO has come to be recognized as the primary forum for building a rule-based trading system globally. And it is that role that I think we need to strengthen. Coming from an organization that mobilizes bodies that in countries are supposed to be establishing those rules in general, that is parliaments, this resonates very well with me. And that is why the IPU over the years, over the 25 years of the existence of the WTO, has established a parliamentary mechanism to accompany the conversation taking place within the WTO. And it seems to me that one of the major challenges facing WTO today is the same that is facing multilateralism as a whole. There's a lack of trust in multilateralism on what it can deliver. And by extension, we see many people tending to throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is not the case. We think, therefore, that WTO has to be brought back to the people. The people have to be involved in the deliberations of the WTO. And that is why I support the proposal that it should be not just governments, but also other stakeholders, parliaments, that can make sure that you trust governments, by the way, civil society, the business sector, and all of that need to come together to help the WTO, sorry for that lapsus, to define a system that is transparent, inclusive, accountable, and fair. I think that is what the global community wants. So it seems to me that responding to the challenges of WTO cannot be divorced from the efforts to address the challenges facing multilateralism today. And if I may go back to proposals that have been made by the global parliamentary community, I would like to mention just a few that can help us in this conversation. It seems to us that first we need to look at how we can help reform the global trade and WTO system as a whole to make it more transparent and inclusive. It seems that we need to help the WTO to resolve the crisis of the dispute mechanism with the settlement mechanism. It seems that there should be more robust efforts in harnessing technology and innovation in order to create an economic revolution that sustains growth and development. It seems to us that we need to make sustainable development the center of the global trading system as articulated by WTO and multilateralism as a whole. And of course, we need to build capacity among institutions, including parliaments, to make sure that they are usefully engaged with the WTO and the rules-based trading system globally. So these are some of the proposals that I am putting on the table that are based on the views of parliamentarians as canvassed by the organization. I would also like to mention and single out the important role that women play in girls, for that matter, and an environment needs to be created that responds to the challenges that they are facing in order to ensure that they enter the productive sector very robustly. Benny, I think those were some of the initial comments that I thought I should make from the parliamentary perspective. We think that it is important that the WTO is more connected with the people, with the grassroots, and we want to make sure that what is being discussed in Geneva trickles down to the country level. And I want to make the case for parliaments as legislators, as controllers of government action at national level, drivers of accountability. I want to make a case for their role in providing for a more transparent, accountable, equitable, and fair global trading system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think you make a very good point about connecting to the people. And obviously you and the IPU as an organization have a lot of experience there. It also links to the point you made about lack of trust in multilateralism, and this might be something we could discuss further. I'm now coming to our final speaker, Frank Heemskerk. Frank, the floor is yours. Your microphone is not on, Frank.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I think it should work. Okay. I was saying thank you, Bernie, for inviting me to this great event and this panel. The European Roundtable for Industry brings together around 55 CEOs, chairs of the largest European multinationals. And we strive for, let's say, a strong, competitive, but truly open Europe as a driver for growth, sustainable growth and prosperity for all. We're happy to celebrate 25 years of WTO. And let's indeed not forget that it's the rule-based multilateral trade system that has laid the foundation for important international economic growth, and also the foundation of lifting millions out of poverty. I say that also with my background at the board of the World Bank. And the WTO has been the backbone of this system, and it's guaranteeing stability in trade systems. And that's so important, not just for the big companies, but definitely also for the smaller companies. As you know, we're both Dutch. We like to ride our bikes. A lot is going on in the world. So let me share a quote from Albert Einstein, who also lived in, and worked in the Netherlands. And he said, life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep moving. And I think that's the challenge now for the WTO for the next 25 years. Of course, many things are going on. Incoming Secretary General, incoming new president in the United States, COVID, green, digital, the rise of China. So what are, let's say, important efforts from a perspective of the European Roundtable? It is saving and strengthening the dispute settlement system, making sure that the referee keeps the whistle, tackling, indeed, like Josh Bolton also said, trade distortion practices, facilitating digital trade. And there, of course, the first order, the preferred solution is multilateral outcomes. But if that's not possible, enable also plurilateral negotiations and a coalition of the front runners. And maybe then finally, also my own experience, ERT believes that it's so important that there's a more structured cooperation between the WTO and civil society and industry. And an advisory body would be welcome. I spent my summer holiday in 2008 in Geneva, and I think we were very, very, very close to getting a deal on the Doha round, but we did not succeed. My observation that time as Minister for Trade for the Netherlands was that also the debate was too much dominated by indeed the special interest, and the silent majority again was silent. And it are the employees, it are the consumers, it are citizens which benefit, let's say, from these global trade agreements. So let's make that visible, involve them as much as possible. And so in that aspect, this panel is very useful. Thank you very much, Bernie.
Thank you very much, Frank. Particularly the point at the end you're making about, involving stakeholders, as we are discussing with you right now, in the work of the WTO, has been with the organization for a very, very long time. It sounds easier than it actually is, because it's something that has to be taken forward by the membership. Now, you said an interesting scene, and your views on what we should be looking out for, should be doing. It's difficult to not agree with that, but it's going to be far more difficult to actually get that done. We've heard each other, or you've heard each other. We now have about 25 to 30 minutes to actually debate with one another and start questioning, or maybe confirming or supporting the things that you've been saying. I know we're on WebEx, but I don't want to lose time or too much time on the internalities of that system. So I'm going to take the liberty to actually ask questions and direct them to you. You can then take the floor further if you want to react to some of the points made by others. I want to start with you, Guy, for the very simple, you were the first speaker. And you made a point about abstract, that trade agreements can no longer be abstract from social, labor, and environmental standards. And it's something I think most people, if not all people, agree with. The big question is here, how are you going to do that? How will that be accomplished? And you know, I think more than almost anybody else in this panel, the history of the sensitivities of these issues.
Now, let me just return to that basic proposition. It's not supposed to be a provocation. It's supposed to be a recognition of the circumstances in which we're in. If anybody can tell me in a plurilateral, regional, whatever setting it is, where it is possible to successfully negotiate important trade agreements without contemplating environmental, social, labor issues, I don't know where that is. I think, where trade negotiations are taking place, it is testimony to the fact that if you try to proceed in abstraction from these issues, it isn't going to happen. And the notion that there's a silent majority rooting for that type of trade agreement seems to me to be in defiance of the realities and the politics of our moment. It just isn't like that. So we do have to, and it hasn't come out in the conversation, it's a bit of a gorilla in the room, isn't it? People have talked about, quite rightly, about the existential issues of climate change, fishing subsidies, trade distortion. But if nobody talks about jobs, employment, living standards, distributional equity issues, you're really missing the issue. And if the WTO confines itself to a discussion about the issues that have been tabled here, important as they undoubtedly are, or reduce the conversation to quote a not very good musical, what are we going to do about a problem called China, you're going to miss it. It isn't going to happen. I think there is a real problem in proceeding in that way. And lastly, and you've no idea how refreshing it is for somebody who runs another multilateral organization to pontificate about the problems of a different person's organization. It's massively therapeutic, let me assure you. I think all of us suffer from what's been said about the lack of support for multilateralism. That applies across the board. And I see three reasons for that challenge. And they've been evoked in this conversation. One is they're not terribly effective. They're not producing results that people think they should. Secondly, it's about this sort of contractual, this transactional sort of approach to multilateralism. It's only worth engaging in if we get more out of it than we put into it. And that's not how multilateralism can work effectively. There's got to be the idea of this not being a zero sum. It's got to be something where everybody can come out of winning. And finally, and I think this is the most damaging and corrosive of all, there is a notion that axiomatically sort of getting involved and accepting the disciplines of multilateralism, be it in the WTO or elsewhere, is a negation or an infringement on national sovereignty. And boy, does that play big in the politics of today. But there is a real point of principle here that we've got to get over that and beat that entirely corrosive feeling, which is selling well in the political circles of the day.
Can I jump in?
Yes, you can. You already
yes.
did.
Thank you. Wonderful. So I suppose I think the world's newest and biggest trade deal, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, doesn't have a labour chapter or an environment chapter. So I suppose, how I have a question, which is how should we think about that, right? And isn't that in tension with the assertion that, well, everyone's now negotiating these deals in the broader social context, or do you think it's a problem that there are no labour or environment chapters there?
Thank you, Samaya. Maybe that's a question we should pass on to Josh, because, I mean, there is this argument that it's easier to negotiate a trade deal if those standards are not present, and this has been part of a discussion for so long. Is that something that you as private sector representative, as high-level private sector representative, agree with, or do you think that's the future of trade agreements, including the standards that Guy referred to, that Samaya is now referring to, are distant or absent in the RCEP?
I don't think it's just the future of trade agreements, it's the present of trade agreements, that labor and environmental standards are now part of the conversation. And that's not resisted by the business community at this point. As long as the rules are reasonable and practical, that's supported. I'd like to send Sumaya's question back to Guy and ask for his reaction to the RCEP agreement, because that in a sense that's almost an outlier now in the international system. It's the system because of the lack of gravity pulling people toward the multilateral system in the WTO. We are getting results like RCEP, and I'm curious what Guy's reaction to it is.
Thank you, Josh. It's clear, as I said in the beginning, this panel doesn't need a moderator. They can clearly do this on their own. Guy, you want to react to this, this bouncing back? Microphone, Guy. Guy, your microphone is off. Okay, while we're waiting for Guy,
okay.
Are you there? Okay, go.
Sorry, I was muted remotely there somewhere. The first thing I have to say is the ILO has no position on the merits or demerits of these chapters, these trade chapters. Where they exist, we're very willing to support their application. Look, the RCEP is perhaps best described as an outlier. I think you have to look to the participants and draw some conclusions about how and where that was negotiated. But it doesn't negate the point I'm making, and I think Josh has perhaps confirmed what I'm saying. This just seems to me to be the way that public support for trade agreements can be secured. I think the US, Canada, Mexico example is a great example, and I think both sides of industry were fundamentally involved in all of this. They seem to think it was a good idea. And it's what is required to secure public support for these things. So my point here is these negotiations are going on. Okay, there are outliers, but the general trend seems to me to be undisputable. If the WTO continues to operate within the boundaries set by what I would call the Singapore dispensation, well, clearly there is no way of being able to operate in the same space and in the same way. And I think that is a fundamental problem. Now, let me say perhaps more clearly than I said at the outset, let's not have a rerun of Singapore 96 and everything that followed. Singapore 96 was followed by Seattle 99, which was another interesting event. But we do need to think about these things. And I think the WTO would be well advised in whatever safe space and whatever non-threatening environment and terms it could be set, to think about these issues. I think that's the limit of my proposition.
Okay, well, but it's a very interesting proposition by any means, again, because of your experience and what you've seen. And I've lived through Singapore and Seattle too, and I remember that vividly. I was still very young, by the way. I would like to also ask the same question to Frank and later to Martin, and also link this to the argument of public support and transparency, because one of the issues that came up in a discussion earlier today between some of the government representatives is that transparency is an issue. If there's no transparency among the membership, if there's no transparency to the public, what are you going to do? How are you going to explain? How are you going to sell? The trust will go down. Is that something that you experience in your current position, but also in your past position as Minister for Trade?
Yes, I agree that the negotiating process has been too intransparent, too technical. I think also in terms of selling, let's say the liberal economists have also not done a good job. I think they've been overselling trade. It's a bigger cake, so everybody should be happy. No, it's indeed the cake is growing, but it's also a different cake, and the cake is being sliced differently. There are some winners, but also clearly some losers. And then coming back to the green standards or social and environmental standards, I think it makes a lot of sense if they're into trade agreements. I think global operating companies are fine. Often they have higher standards because they have global standards. Of course, they want them to be pragmatic and transparent. But if you do realize that the cake is growing, but also sliced differently, and you need to, let's say, make adjustments, there I'm sometimes a bit worried that people are expecting too much, that if you incorporate it in trade agreements, that it will be dealt with. No, most of, let's say, the social component and also of the environmental component of, let's say, making the shift is a lot of domestic policy. So don't blame, let's say, these trade agreements on all the negative outcomes.
Thank you very much, Frank. Martin, can you shortly react to this particular point? And then I want to go to Celine to talk a little bit about what Frank just said. Martin, please.
Yeah, thank you, Bernie. I can speak from the experience of the Parliamentary Conference on the WTO. And what I have been hearing over the past 20 years is the need for greater transparency. People decry the lack of openness and transparency in terms of WTO processes and procedures. And that brought me to the point that I made earlier, that the people should be brought back to the scene and make sure that their voices are being heard in these international deliberations. Let's be clear, power to negotiate and conclude agreements lies with governments. That is very clear. But those conventions and treaties have to be based on reality, and those realities can be articulated by different stakeholders apart from governments. This includes civil society, the private sector, legislators in particular, because they have been elected by the people specifically to articulate their interests. This has to be taken to the international level. And we have talked about effectiveness at the national level. Parliaments have a role to play. When you look at the trade facilitation agreement, yes, it was negotiated and concluded in Geneva or whatever, but those who were supposed to cause them to be ratified are parliaments. And if they have not been involved in the discussions, at least to provide some inputs that may not be binding on the negotiators, if they have been given the opportunity to express the concerns of the people, the preoccupations, I think that the process of ratification, creating local ownership would be promoted, would be encouraged more, and would stand a greater chance of success. So I would like to argue for a conversation that takes place at country level too, that would involve various stakeholders. The outcome of these conversations can then be fed into the global negotiating processes. It doesn't mean that everyone has to be at the table at the WTO to negotiate this, but the conventions have to be based on the issues that have been canvassed from the grassroots at national level.
Thank you for those points. Again, we're coming to the idea of transparency, trust, and expectations. Celine, you in the beginning said that if there's one organization, I think I got you there, if I understood correctly, can do this, can go for a green recovery, can be supportive of the XI, it's the WTO. Now, that's, of course, music to our ears, certainly to a WTO representative. But having heard the others right now, do you think that's realistic? And wouldn't that not add too much to the sort of expectation list that is actually growing?
Well, I mean, if you're failing the expectation, the main expectation, you know, we need to be able, I mean, I'm a mother. I want to live a world in which my children have enough resources, have a stable climate. No one can flourish, and certainly not people in developing countries. I mean, I've been working for Oxfam before my current job for years. If we don't have a stable climate, the last time we didn't have a stable climate, human population plummeted. So I really take issue at saying this is yet another issue. This is the issue of the 21st century. Can we live in peace with enough resources for people to flourish? So if you're not going to answer that issue, then you might as well go out of business. And I also think it's a core issue of the WTO. Subsidies is a core issue of the WTO. Why are we allowing the lack of a fair playing field, you know, where the most powerful country on earth, who have a lot of money to subsidize, are actually preventing the poorest countries on earth from having, you know, the right to enter market and the right to flourish from markets. I mean, I used to work, as you know, on cotton subsidies. This, you know, scandal is still going on today. So to me, it's not another issue. It's mainstreaming this very important issue into everything the WTO does, and starting with subsidies. Let's sign tomorrow the agreement on fish subsidies. 18 years going on in negotiations. We still have 20 billion worth of subsidies that, according to the FAO, contribute to overfishing. If you calculate that, I did a short calculation, that is the equivalent of 3 million hospital beds in developing countries. How can we justify that an expenditure like that, which is destroying natural resources, is also depriving the world's poorest countries of much needed resources to face the pandemic?
Those are convincing arguments, but I'm not here to actually sort of take sides or make choices. I want to go to you, Sumaya, because you are someone who follows us closely, who writes about us, and therefore is very familiar with public opinion and very familiar with, you know, the idea or the way people look at WTO, the way they understand it or not understand it. Is what you have heard so far too, is there indeed this lack of trust? And is that lack of trust, you know, can that be regained by just coming out with results, you know, results out of negotiations at the WTO? Or are there other matters that you see, certainly as a journalist, that should be done or should be taken care of?
Okay, so a couple of things. So first of all, most people don't know what the WTO is, as we all know, and I'm not sure they really need to. I think the WTO is, it's a forum when it might hear about things when they're going really wrong, and so perhaps it's good that it doesn't hear about that so much. In terms of trust, I think that generally it becomes, the danger is that essentially politicians or anyone essentially takes advantage of the lack of understanding of what the WTO is, right? I think the most common misperception I hear, including not from the person on the street, but also people who are fairly engaged with the news and politics and so on. People sometimes think of the WTO as a kind of institution that is in some way separate from the members, right? So the idea that the WTO is a member-driven organization, the idea is that the WTO doesn't really exist if not for its member governments. The WTO is just a collection of past decisions that individual governments have made. that so the misperception of what the WTO is, right? The idea that, oh, the WTO could force us to do this, or the WTO could prevent us from doing this. That kind of feeds in a very unhealthy way to the debate about sovereignty, right? And I kind of see it in the US among I suppose trade remedy lawyers. So one of the big challenges facing the WTO right now is that the appellate body, the dispute settlement system, has been dismantled. And a big contributor to American grievances about that is the way that the appellate body, that the dispute settlement system, made judgments about what was consistent with the rules. Right? What did America initially sign up to? Now, of course, if under the dispute settlement system, if it decided actually, no, America is breaking the rules, then no country can be forced to do anything by the WTO, right? It's just a question of, well, if you are breaking the rules and you decide you want to do that, you can be retaliated against. But as it happens, the policymakers in power at the time decided to change the rules to become in conformity with the rules, to change behavior to become in conformity with the rules. And that kind of contributed to this impression that the WTO was somehow forcing America to do something that wasn't in its best interests or was bad for it. And that, so that, I think that kind of makes kind of hard prescriptions really tricky. I'm not sure a big public information campaign to explain to everyone, hi guys, this is what the WTO does. I'm not sure that's going to have big returns. I almost think that, having, perhaps in the past when you had disputes, having governments say, you know what, we really want to do this, right? Take climate. We really want to impose a carbon border adjustment tax. And, maybe it's not in keeping with the promises we made in the past, and that's okay. We can rebalance, right? The rebalancing hasn't happened that often in the past, and that kind of, I think, has contributed to this impression that the WTO is some kind of is binding countries to decisions that they made 20 years ago without being able to update them. I'm not sure this is very clear, but basically less public information campaign, more sort of taking a look at the rules and where previous commitments don't make sense anymore, having a grown-up discussion about, well, okay, how are other countries going to take that, and how shall we rebalance our obligations so that you can get out of this quite toxic sovereignty debate.
Thank you, Sumaya. I hear where you're coming from, and I understand you fully well that when it comes to public relations campaign explaining what the WTO is, that doesn't always resonate because there's so few people that follow what this organization actually does. It's part of a bigger picture. The question then is, who should be doing that? I mean, is it us as WTO Secretariat? Is it governments? Is it the private sector? Is it other international organizations? Is it the media? And that kind of discussion has been happening before. I mean, looking at each other like, who is supposed to explain what the WTO is? Now, we are the WTO. We're trying to do our part, but it doesn't always succeed. Why? Because it's a very complicated matter that we deal with. And I told you that I would select otherwise, but is anybody wanting to react to that? And after that, we'll actually start going to questions because they're going to pour in from the public. Frank, your hand is up. Please.
Yeah, I think for the WTO itself, I mean, it's don't tell us, show us. So it's, it's showing results on the big themes, on digital, on green, on trade distortions, on state subsidies. That's where you deliver. And then it's up to us, for example, the private sector, to continue to convince in every meeting we have, and we do so with heads of state. We tell them that it's so important that Europe is constructive and that WTO needs to be reformed, but that rule-based system, that predictability is crucial for smaller and bigger companies. So I'm afraid, Bernie, that you're doing a great job, but don't tell the outside world that you're doing a great job. I mean, show the results, make them tangible, and have other allies and I'm sure Business Roundtable is doing the same in the US, convincing that the CEOs are convincing their employees, their customers, and therefore politicians and society that it's in their interest to have, let's say, predictable global standards.
Thank you, Frank. Showing results. Okay, that's a challenge. Celine first, and then Martin, please.
WTO, I was also I very much agreed with what Mr. Hemskirk said. You know, domestic reform is really important. And sometimes there are governments that are blaming the WTO for all evils. And obviously it's very difficult for the WTO to say that they're wrong. So I'm not sure I have a solution, but it's the same with the European Union, right? When governments are signing a deal with one hand, and then as soon as they're back home, they pretend that they had nothing to do in this because they don't have the courage to sell it back to their population. And I don't know to what extent having a real discussion with parliamentarians so that what they bring to negotiation is really a political agreement would strengthen their hand to have the courage when they go back home to tell the truth. This was in our interest. And yes, there will be some pain, but there is also some gain, and not blame a transnational organization or anything for what they decided to sign on to.
Thank you, Celine. Martin, you wanted to say something too, right?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to jump on what Celine has just said, that there should be that conversation with parliaments. And this is very crucial. I think other mechanisms have shown the benefits of engagement with parliaments. When you look at the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council, the fact that parliaments are increasingly involved in the review of the reports before the reports are presented to the Human Rights Council has helped to create some involvement and follow-up at national level. The same thing with the voluntary national reviews of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we could foresee a mechanism too, whereby there is a conversation at national level on the negotiating positions of the government, that parliamentarians are informed and can provide inputs on how governments are going about negotiations at the WTO. And then coming back to the issue of explaining to the public, I think that this is a responsibility of the institution, the WTO. Without vaunting the merits of WTO, they can explain objectively what the organization is all about. And I do have some experience. We do have some experience working with WTO, organizing capacity building programs for parliamentarians to educate them, quote unquote, on some aspects of the global trading system. I can see that type of partnership evolving for different constituencies that are out there that could make an input, a very positive input into the work of the WTO. So I would say that the Secretariat can take the lead on this because it's not about taking positions, it's about explaining technically, objectively what it is that the WTO is all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I certainly wouldn't say that we're doing a good job or a bad job. We're trying hard and we're trying our best. We need help from friends like yours to explain what is done in here, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and where it's going or where it's not going. I want to thank you for this. This is a very interesting exchange. I'm pretty sure we can continue, but I'm looking a little bit at time here, and we got some questions coming in from the audience. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pose those, and where they are directed to one of you, I'll go straight to you. If not, I'll probably direct it myself. The first question I have here, or the first question I want to pose, is from Elena Antoni. And she's asking, how can WTO effectively mainstream environmental sustainability? What will that mean for ongoing work in investments, facilitation, agriculture, or others? Celine, can I start with you, given that's a territory you know well?
Well, that's a big question, but yes. Well, I think if we take the example, well, in general, one of the recommendations we've been making is to have a body of experts represent different bodies of science aligned with sustainable development to come together as a commission and to advise the new DG. So we make sure that the mainstreaming of SDGs into trade is really directed by a body of scientists that will be unbiased and providing their best recommendations back to the WTO to insulate those discussions from, the political maneuvering that obviously different countries have based on their trade interests. But then if I look very specifically at agricultural subsidies, I think that we need to be making progress in terms of understanding, if we look at domestic support, export subsidies, green box, to make sure that we square this with what are environmentally harmful subsidies or climate distorting subsidies. And like we are doing on fish, we should really make sure that we are moving towards a phase out, a gradual phase out of climate distorting or environmentally harmful subsidies. So that would be one way to effectively mainstream sustainability and ensure that we transform food systems so everyone can fulfill its right to food in the years to come.
Thanks, Celine. Can I pose a follow-up question to you on the basis of the first question? You're talking about scientists and advisory bodies with scientists that could advise the incoming Director General of the WTO or otherwise. There seems to be a growing argument and a growing body of people that say we need to have scientific support and arguments for certain matters happening in the area of trade. Do you think that's the future of some of the discussions we're having here? You mentioned fish. I can think of health. I can think of other matters.
Well, I believe in evidence-based policy making. And I think, yes, it is really important to have the right scientific advice. I mean, can we imagine that the UNFCCC would have had the outcome it has had with the Paris Agreement without an IPCC? So I'm very much in favor of that. And obviously, we live in a post-fact world and many people are questioning the value of science. But if you look at opinion polls, scientists are still the most trusted individuals in society. So if you want to rebuild trust, I have a lot of scientist friends.
I think I do too. I check. Anyway, thank you for your answer. I have another question here, which I'm going to pose. This is coming from Susanna Pack from the ITC. It says, if you had to prioritize what comes first, global rules that make e-commerce easier or protect consumer data? And I want to put that question to Josh. Can you try to answer that one? A microphone is off, I think.
Okay, I'm fighting with the moderator over the microphone. Sorry, Bernie. Which comes first? Pose the question again for me.
I will. Don't worry. The person is asking what should come first or what should we prioritize? Global rules that make e-commerce easier or that protect consumer data?
Well, the answer obviously is do both. They're both extremely important. But I think the protection of consumer data is going to be with us indefinitely. It's an evolving area, and I think it's one where it will just have to be done step by step, making progress in protecting consumer data. The real challenge at this moment, not to suggest that data protection isn't a challenge, the real challenge at this moment is in making sure that digital commerce can actually proceed. Now, some of the impediments to that are government inconsistencies on protecting consumer data. But we urgently need to arrive at some sort of international consensus about how to treat digital products for purposes of taxation and market access and all other elements of trade. And I think it's one of the most important issues for a revitalized WTO to take up, to do what Frank was talking about and Bernie, you were talking about in the 2 questions ago. We support for this entity, and we can generate support by showing results, by showing that it's useful.
I think we're losing you, Josh. Let's see if we can come back to you later on in case your answer wasn't finished, but we lost you at a certain point in time. I'm going to pose another question, and this question is from an anonymous person who clearly doesn't want to be identified, but it's an interesting question. The pandemic has greatly impacted our economies and many people have lost their jobs. This may increase anti-globalization sentiments. How do you deal with that? Now, I would just transfer that question over to Guy. How would you advise the WTO should deal with that?
Will the pandemic sort of feed into anti-globalization sentiment? It's not really my impression, at least as we've seen previous waves of anti-globalization sentiment. What I see rather happening is debate taking place about the, for example, the organization of production along extended global supply chains, and whether for reasons either of security, safeguarding essential supplies, or a feeling that we do, and I hear these words being used in a way which sometimes surprises me, whether we have to look at national or regional economic sovereignty. You hear this type of language being used in sometimes, to me, unexpected places. Well, I think these debates are out there. You know, are we going to go into some sort of process of deglobalization, drawing on the lessons of the pandemic? Now, I don't think this would respond to an upsurge of, can I say, grassroots anti-globalization sentiment. I think it would be much more a higher level. How can we make globalization more secure and more resilient to the type of external shock that the pandemic has represented? And in my experience, that's a bit of a different discussion than some of the previous pro-anti-globalization stories that have characterized the history of the WTO over the decades.
No, clearly it's a completely different discussion right now than it was like 20 years ago. And it's definitely therefore requiring a different kind of response and presumably a more coordinated response, which is what I hear from all of you. Let me see if I have another question. I understand the connection with Josh is still not restored. So I'll come back to you later, but I'm not sure if you finished your answer.
Bernie, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. I'd like to pick. I think I finished with the previous question. I'd like to jump in on this one, and follow up to agree with Guy on the question of anti-globalization, and just add the additional point that the pandemic may be an opportunity to demonstrate that globalization may actually benefit all the people on the planet if the nations of the world respond properly to the pandemic. And that is, if we keep our supply chains open so that medical supplies and equipment and vaccines as they're needed can flow around the world to where they are needed. And if we demonstrate, the international community demonstrates that we understand that there is no such thing as taking care of just your own country in the midst of a pandemic. The pandemic will only be defeated if we defeat it globally around the world. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that the pandemic may create a moment for anti-globalization.
This is very interesting, actually, because that is basically, or sort of, what Guy was also suggesting. Are other members of the panel in agreement with that? Sumaya, what do you think of that point? That, you know, it might actually help us, which is a dangerous thing to say.
I'm not sure anyone is going to take to the streets marching in support of globalization anytime soon, right? I think probably the best we can hope for is that that some recognition of the fact that, you know, what we have relied on other countries for personal protective equipment or other supplies, that does kind of make people see the benefits of global supply chains. I suppose I fear that there's going to be an inequality here, right? So in big countries, so in the US, in the EU, where it's possible to bring production in, there is going to be a kind of shift, a bit of a backlash, and there's going to be moves towards the more kind of sort of security end of things. Whereas smaller countries who don't have that kind of power are going to sort of, you know, they understand all too well the fact that they need open borders, and so, you know, perhaps they will recognize things. And we've already seen various countries put forward initiatives for ensuring free trade in various medical products, and I suppose I feel a bit sad and skeptical that some of the bigger countries will agree, for example, to agree not to apply export restrictions if another crisis were to come again.
Can I just probe you further on that? Why do you think that? Why do you fear that?
Because the experience of the crisis was when things got really bad. The French decided to, for example, essentially take some supplies that were destined to other countries. Right, we had this very naked show of, you know, my citizens first, and you know, the politics of it was that if you as a government were seen to be sending supplies elsewhere, even if those elsewhere places were places like Italy, which was having a really, really bad time, that politics didn't work. And so for a country like the EU, for a bloc like the EU, you know, I think they would support other countries lowering their tariffs on medical products because they might be the ones to export some of the higher value added stuff. But I just, given they're the ones who have quite a lot of power, I just don't see them handing over the right to put up barriers to exports outside the bloc if there was another crisis. So there have been proposals about, you know, let's all lower our import barriers, but really it's the export restrictions that are the really dangerous ones, because then countries are just very, very vulnerable to being shut out.
Bernie, may I jump in here?
Please, go ahead.
Because I'm not sure whether I fully understand Sumaya, but I think ultimately, for example, in Europe, the internal market did survive this crisis. And of course, there was an initial response by some EU member states where they said, okay, export restrictions, including into the internal market. But ultimately, there were green lanes and let's say all the medical equipment was flowing. I do know that one of our members is producing in the US. But the components came from 60 different countries, the ventilators. So in that sense, I'm with Josh that it also shows that if you, let's say, continue to, let's say, not have these tariffs and not have these trade barriers, that there are global solutions possible for local problems. Secondly, but that's a totally different response to COVID, I do think that in many boards of the bigger companies, of course, they are reassessing their supply chains and further diversification will take place. but also, let's say, closer to home. But that's from a risk perspective. And they were too overstretched. So you will see some, let's say, some relocalization. But you know, if that's also a positive thing. But overall, COVID, in my perspective, did not lead to and especially the health component, did not lead to a huge, let's say, anti-globalization, additional protectionism in the country. So I'm also with Josh in this respect.
Could I come in as well?
Of course you can.
Well, I think, you know, COVID shows that the politics of scarcity are very ugly. And, you know, if we get to a situation where there is scarcity of critical materials, things will get ugly. And that's why you need a rules-based system, but you also need to prevent those situations where you enter a scarcity scenario where it's either you getting it or I getting it. Because very few nations will be so inclined as to share if they feel they're in danger. And I agree with Guy that there's a different element on deglobalization, which is this strategic autonomy, resilient supply chains, which, you know, could be, you know, as you say, Frank, evidence-based and reasonable about some degree of relocalization, but they could be also misused to justify all sorts of protectionist return to protectionism in ways that would actually be very detrimental to developing countries, and that might not get the supply chains to be greener either. So I do think we need to be very vigilant in making sure that all this talk about strategic autonomy and resilience is really aligned to evidence, but also is aligned to sustainable development goals. We cannot relocalize at the expense of the poorest countries on earth.
Thank you, Celine. I'm going to move to another question, which is on another subject, even though this is very interesting. I have a question from Geoff Bigton from the United States of America, and he's asking, would creation of a global trade parliament, like the EU Parliament, as part of the WTO's institutional structure, advance the WTO's objective of increasing legitimacy and transparency? Now, I'm going to first ask Martin, because this is very much your territory, and you spoke about this already, but it would be very interesting to know if such a body would be created, or if such a body can be created, because obviously, as you know better than I do, there are certain sensitivities there.
Yeah, well, the thing again is you have to look at the role of such a body. If its role would be to break trust in the global trading system, that's fine, because it would create that transparency that we are asking for. But if it were to contribute to the fashioning of the rules that will govern the trading system, that's a little bit problematic, because there is, I think, then a kind of blurred separation of powers. As I said earlier, the governments have the prerogative, according to the constitutions of countries, to conclude international treaties and agreements that are binding on their countries. And if you were to create a separate body that is divorced from parliaments to do that same role, then there will be a conflict of interest here. The role of parliaments is to make sure that the rules that are agreed internationally are woven into the national legislative framework. Their role is to hold governments accountable at the national level. Their role is to provide resources for those agreements to be implemented in an effective manner. If you are going to create a parliament, so to speak, internationally, that parliament would only have advisory powers, making sure that there is some transparency in the procedures of WTO or the global trading system as a whole, and that the views of the people, again, are articulated at that level and factored into the negotiating processes.
Thank you. Can I, as a follow-up, pose a question to Josh here? Because Frank, you made a point earlier about, you know, that there should be some kind of involvement of civil society, of the private sector, of parliamentarians at the WTO. Is that something you share as an idea? Because I know, I mean, this is the territory I know very well, because I work in the midst of it. And there are very different views on whether or not bringing in outside views into the debates and the discussions at the WTO would help, or the other way around, would actually limit or stall certain discussions. Do you have a view on that, or do you support the idea of bringing people on board or closer?
I do have a view, and it's informed by my experience when I worked at the U.S. Trade Representative's office during the Uruguay round. And that is that it's absolutely essential for governments to bring along their own constituencies and stakeholders, the business community, civil society, all of the stakeholders that need to be at the table, environmental groups, labor groups, the whole bit. And the U.S. system is, I think, reasonably well structured to take that input in. But that's at the input end. At the output end, only the government can speak for the government. I think we're courting chaos, even much worse than we have today, if we institutionalize a lot of different voices having a seat at the table. That's the purpose of government, is to represent all of the stakeholders within their borders. And I shudder at the notion of institutionalizing a great deal of other voices, putting a burden on a process that's already shown itself to be far too constipated to begin with.
I haven't been referred to as working for an organization that's constipated, but I'll remember that one. Guy, can I bounce that to you? Because you are the leader of an organization that actually has formalized involvement of some of the most important stakeholders, but it's very, very much regulated and has its clear procedures, and it seems to work. How would that, mirror towards the WTO? Is it something that can be mirrored? And I will come to Selina after that.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, our organization has, as decision-making partners, labor and business at the table. I'm not sure that I would recommend it for others, or for the reasons that have been mentioned by others, whether that would be applicable to the WTO. I mean, I think there is a dilemma here, but it's a dilemma that needs to be resolved. That is to say, and I do understand this, the WTO is a negotiating body, and the people who negotiate are governments. I mean, they have the representative mandate to do so. I guess the square that's got to be circle has got to be squared, excuse me, is how to have that negotiating function protected, remain intact, but in some way which takes advantage of and benefits from the advice of civil society and other stakeholders. And my own view is, and it relates to the earlier conversation about external communications, I think the WTO would be well advised to find appropriate spaces and mechanisms to have those stakeholders inside the organization properly placed, because that is a much more effective way of getting the realities of an organization across than is external communications, which, given the complexity and technicity of trade negotiations, is always going to be a hard lift for Bernie, for people like yourself who are trying to make understood things which are not easily understood. People's attention spans are not terribly long when you get into the arcane issues of WTO negotiations. And I would plead guilty on that charge.
So you're saying that I bored you for years when you were in another organization. Sorry for that. Well, it's a bit like what you're saying is it's a bit like cooking. You're trying to perfect the recipe and you're trying all sorts of different ingredients, but you can't get to the final product. Celine, I'm going to come to you now, and you're going to be the final speaker because we're running out of time, and then I'm going to close this panel. Celine, the last word is yours.
Well, I think the WTO should take inspiration from the UNFCCC. A few years before Paris, there was a decision to launch the Paris-Lima agenda, where businesses and civil society came together, not at the negotiation table, but in a way that they could really be there and participate and speak with each other. And this is what brought life back into the UNFCCC negotiations. Without that, we wouldn't have had the Paris Agreement. So I think it's time for the WTO to embrace that. And I think there are ways to do it in which, you know, you could actually reach better outcomes than what you have right now. So I would strongly recommend it. Take lead from the UNFCCC.
I hear you, Celine, and I hope the message will be transferred. Can I thank you very much for your time and your engagement and your frankness and honesty. I mean, these panels stand or fall with the way in people interact, and this was actually fantastic. If I would be asked to advise my incoming Director General on members for an advisory body, I think you all would be fantastic candidates. I just don't know if your mandate would allow it. But anyway, it's much appreciated by the audience. So I want to thank you for what you've done, for your input. It's been an honor to welcome you and to be part of the 25th anniversary here. I also want to thank the audience for listening in and sending questions, some of them quite direct and provocative, but all of them very, very interesting. And finally, I want to thank the people that made this possible. You can't really see them, but there's many people who make this work in a totally virtual setting. So I really want to thank all of the colleagues that have been doing this. I wish all of you a good afternoon and a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.